All right. It's 12 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with my introduction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to yet another one of our virtual Laguna community education programs. This one is Life in the Laguna with Denise Cadman. If you haven't already, feel free to say hello in the chat box and let us know where you are tuning in from today. My name is Allison Titus. I am the Community Education Manager here at the Laguna Foundation. In addition to Denise, we are also joined by Christine Fontaine, our Education Director here at the Laguna Foundation. She'll be managing the chat and fielding questions throughout the webinar. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Allison. Hi, Denise. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
My introduction will be brief today as well, same as our last webinar, because we will be learning a lot about the Laguna from Denise. The Laguna Foundation, however, is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa that works to restore, conserve, and inspire public appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands. The Laguna is a wetland complex and a 22-mile long channel, as well as an entire watershed. If you live in Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, or Windsor, some of the most populated areas in Sonoma County, you live within the Laguna watershed. The Laguna de Santa Rosa is designated as a wetland of international importance because of the incredible variety of life it supports, flora and fauna alike, which we will be going over in depth today throughout our program. Even though many of you are probably all too familiar with Zoom at this point, I'll start with a few housekeeping notes for a successful webinar experience. You're muted and your video is off for this webinar. If we could see and hear all of you, it would probably be pretty chaotic. Christine and I will have our video on during the introduction and when we take questions throughout the webinar, and Denise will leave her video on through the webinar. You can add your questions and say hello in the chat box. So if you haven't found that already, you can hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen and the option to select the chat box should pop up. Click on the chat box icon and say hi if you haven't, and use that small gray drop-down menu above your chat box to address your question either to the panelists only or all panelists and attendees. We will pause the webinar to take questions that are coming up in the chat at one point during the webinar. Otherwise, we will save the questions for the end as time allows. We will also have some announcements at the very end of the program for other virtual events that you can get involved with. All right. Our presenter today is Denise Cadman. She was originally going to give her annual Biology of the Laguna talk in person to our new class of docents this year in March, but has graciously agreed to adapt her talk for the webinar format. We are so lucky to learn about the Laguna from her today because Denise has been an environmental steward of the Laguna for more than 25 years. She grew up in the wilds of Rincon Valley and earned her BA, secondary teaching credential, and Master of Arts degree in biology from Sonoma State University. She works as an environmental specialist for the City of Santa Rosa, focused on creek stewardship, environmental education, and resource management. Additionally, she teaches at Santa Rosa Junior College as an adjunct faculty member in the Life Science Department. Denise has been a huge part of teaching and inspiring a love of the Laguna through the Laguna Foundation's docent training program since its inception in 1998. And she continues to share that knowledge today as well through programs like these and other ways. So Denise, thank you so much for joining us today and spending even more time on Zoom outside of your classroom Zoom time with us today. I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Allison. Well, hello, everyone. I'm trying to get used to this new way of being, and as a presenter who gets a lot of my energy and enthusiasm from interacting with people that I'm communicating with, it's been challenging. So I'm just going to imagine all of your smiling faces out there. And I think I'll even imagine that you're laughing at my attempts at humor. And that way, hopefully I'll keep things lively. And I'm going to dive right in to life in the Laguna. I want to just preface it with a few things. As Allison mentioned, I mean, we're part of this greater watershed, the boundary here shown in yellow, that includes so much more than just the main channel of the Laguna and its floodplains, but all of its tributary creeks and upland areas. And, you know, this watershed is an area of land that captures, moves water. So water falls on the high points of the landscape and drains down to the low parts. And it can drain at the surface or underground. The watershed also moves pollutants along with the water, or anything that's dissolved, the living organisms, the dead biomass. So the watershed is this encompassing lifeboat for us that is providing everything we need. So just like a sailor lost at sea, when you think about what humans really need to survive, it should all be here in our watershed. Our food, our water, our shelter, our purpose, and our place. And so, of course, it behooves us to keep our lifeboat in good shape. We don't want any leaky holes. And that way we'll, you know, be safe at sea. So the watershed is made up of both wetland and upland parts. I'm just going to remind you briefly that wetlands have a specific legal definition based on the Clean Water Act, which restricted the fill of wetlands. So wetlands are the interface of water and land. So the middle of the ocean is just wet. And where I'm sitting right now in Heron Hall is just land. But when we find the interface between those two habitat types, it drives up opportunity for living organisms and therefore biodiversity. So a wetlands legal definition is you have to have some water. Water only need be standing for 14 consecutive days. So you look for presence of standing water or evidence that water had been there. You also look at the plant species. So certain species only grow in wet places, and depending on what proportion they make of the landscape, that will signal a wetland. And also soils are unique in wetlands. So wetlands soils form in the presence of standing or saturated conditions with very little oxygen. And that makes telltale signs that you can use to diagnose those soils. Wetlands, as I said, don't have to be wet all the time. So we have perennial creeks. Of course, the Laguna has water in it year round. And then there are creeks that are seasonal. They dry up completely in the summer months, and some are quite ephemeral. They only flash up during the biggest storms and are gone. We have a very dynamic situation here in our Mediterranean climate. So the Laguna is going to change not only through the seasons of the year, but also year to year, because we have such incredibly big changes in the amount of rainfall. And in fact, what the average turns out to be is kind of right in the middle between all the years that flood and all the years that we have drought in California. And that's the way it's always been. So here's a spring shot of the Laguna de Santa Rosa. This is looking south from the bridge over Occidental Road. You can see the water levels are kind of at bank full and everything's nice and green. In the fall, same location, water levels are lower, colors are starting to change. Now we're into the rainy season. So the Laguna has overtopped its banks and started to spread out across its floodplain. And then same location after a really big storm. This particular picture was taken on the New Year's Day storm of 2005-06. where the road went underwater. So I had to wait for the water to go down before I could even go out to take the picture. So this isn't at the height. And I've seen that happen, a handful of times since I've been living near this location. Most recently was really just a little over a year ago when we had our big March storms. The other thing about the watershed is that, of course, it's full of people, and that people influence a watershed, just like the topography does, just like the soil type does, just like every other living creature does. Humans have a long history in the Laguna de Santa Rosa of over 12,000 years. And in that time, we've done things to change the landscape through agriculture, through urban development. We've vacillated between embracing the Laguna, thinking of it as a gem where we go to recreate and enjoy ourselves, to the opposite end of the spectrum where we basically turned our back on the Laguna and started just throwing our trash over our shoulder into it. People influence the watershed. Now I'm going to switch gears and start building my theme, which today is going to be about biodiversity and how everything is connected. And it's not just living things that are connected to each other, it's also living things connected to the physical environment in which they live. So I have a few slides to just give us a guide to our system, a few basic principles that will move forward on our journey through the biodiversity in the Laguna. First is matter cycles. So we have this finite supply of water on planet Earth. The water that's here today is the only water that's ever been here. It's the only water we'll ever have. You can safely say that the water you're drinking is dinosaur pee. And that means then that all water is recycled water used over and over again. It moves through the physical landscape and living organisms. Likewise, major nutrients like carbon and nitrogen are cycled both through the physical environment and the biological environment. And that, of course, rocks are cycled as well. So mountain ranges rise and erode, and matter is constantly being recycled. Next principle is that energy flows. So we're a solar powered planet here, and the sun powers the growth of photosynthetic organisms, producers that make food for consumers. And energy is not created or destroyed, but changes form like matter. And energy is being constantly lost from the system. So every time energy changes from one organism, let's say, to another, a great deal of that energy is lost as heat. So there's more sunshine than there are plants, and there's more plants than there are animals that consume them, and so on. We'll come back and talk about that some more. And lastly, that life webs, that everything is connected through these interwoven networks of who eats who and who helps who and where each organism lives. So just to, put the spotlight on the most important group of organisms, producers are the organisms that make food for everyone else. Producers, or as another ecological term would describe it, autotrophs, self-feeding organisms, are going to use sun energy to take carbon dioxide out of the air and put it into a glucose molecule, sugar essentially. And that can be then built up for all consumers. So who are these producers? Well, there's a couple of categories. So there are photosynthetic bacteria, those are cyanobacteria, and also algae, which are plant-like. And then we have our plant group. They could be woody plants like trees and shrubs, or herbaceous. So we have broadleaf plants, which are referred to as forbs, think wildflowers there. And then we have our grasses. And again, each category can be subdivided. Your grasses can be annual versus perennial. Some plants look grass-like, but they're in a different group of grass-like plants, sedges and rushes. So this is the food. This is the base of the food web, and everybody else is going to consume plants or another organism that has consumed plants. Okay, so again, photosynthesis is this really miraculous process where plants breathe in the exact same air we're breathing in, and then breathe out a loaf of bread. And they're able to take that gaseous carbon dioxide, use sunlight energy to fix it into a sugar molecule, and make oxygen, free oxygen to boot, which is, of course, critical for our survival as well. So if you're not a producer, you're a consumer. And consumers are made up of several groups. Most bacteria are consumers, as we are. Protozoa are animal-like members of the kingdom Protista. They tend to be all unicellular, microscopic, so we're typically not thinking about them very much. But then, of course, we're very familiar with animals and fungi. So even though fungi look superficially plant-like, they're really much more animal-like because they are consumers as we are. So I'm just going to take a quick look at these different consumers. Herbivores, these are your vegetarians. They're going to be eating plant material. Omnivores will take a mixture of both plant and animal material. And I put the quail in there just to remind us that even if a bird is mostly a grain-eating bird, eating seeds as quail do, they are still feeding their young insects. They need protein, especially for the rapid growth that occurs when they're nestlings. So I'm kind of emphasizing how important insects are to other consumers in higher trophic levels, and birds in particular. All birds feed their young insects. And of course, we're omnivores as well, which is why raccoons love our trash so much. So carnivores, the mighty, the powerful, the deadly, that ladybug is just murder on those aphids. Parasites, so these are all parasites that affect humans. I was looking for pictures of leeches, and I decided I still have a thing about them. I remember when I was an instructional aide at the junior college years and years ago, I had to actually move them from a major aquarium into a finger bowl for students to look at. And I thought I'd kind of gotten over my fear and disgust of leeches, but in looking at pictures to put this one in, no, it's not true. So I'll just cover that up quickly with a parasitic plant. This is daughter, and that this is an example of a parasitoid. So this is when an insect larva feeds on an insect host, and that's a tomato hornworm. So in this case, I think you can say that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So that is parasites that consume energy, extract energy from a living host, but decomposers extract energy from dead organic matter. So they're going to eat dead organisms and their waste and any cast off body parts like leaves or, you know, your clipped toenails or skin cells. So decomposers are mostly, most importantly, made up of bacteria and fungi, but there is all kinds of classes of organisms that aid in the decomposition process, that act more maybe as detritivores to break the organic material down, expose surface area, and then allow the decomposers to come in and finish the job. And all these organisms are organized in this trophic structure where we see it is like a pyramid, that the biggest amount of energy, the J stands for joules, is sunlight. And then at each level, we get a 90% reduction. So that's the energy that's being lost as heat. So top predators then become few and far between because so much energy is lost as that energy is transferred through that trophic structure. When we think about the trophic structure, we often think of it in terms of a food chain. That's kind of a simplified version, because what we're sort of indicating in this diagram for both terrestrial and aquatic food chains is that you would think that like the grasshopper only eats that plant and the mouse only eats the grasshopper, but that's not the way it is. We know that each predator takes many prey items. So we have this interacting web of life, and that there are connections throughout the watershed. Okay, well, I'm going to just check in, Chris, really quickly and see if there's any questions that I might answer from that initial introduction.
Not any questions, Denise, but I want to share some reactions from the audience. You are getting some LOLs on your jokes.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes.
You know, I think I always imagine myself to be funny, and today I'm really doing that in force. So thank you.
And one other comment that I want to share with you, and it is that this presentation could be the basis for a great book.
Oh.
So we'll keep that thought in mind.
All right, will do. All right, on we go then. Thank you, Chris.
Yes.
So we talked about who eats who. Okay, that's real straightforward. And I just let this slide in because I've got my murderous ladybug here again. I did want to point out, this is a ladybug larva. Not everybody knows what they look like. So that's the juvenile form. And so I know that people kill them sometimes when they find them in their garden, but remember, they eat aphids too. They eat bad bugs too, and they're going to grow up to be a ladybug. So I thought I'd point that out. Okay, so we've got predation covered. I'll just add one other element, which is that, of course, herbivores can kill plants by taking, you know, big bites out of them, and especially granivores that eat the seed of the plant, okay, because then you've really murdered the next generation. And that leads to all kinds of then adaptations that the plant will make to avoid being eaten. So that's why we have thorns, and that's why we have spines. And this particular plant, Lactuca, or prickly lettuce as it's called, has a milky white exudate that is very bitter and unpalatable. So it's this arms war where organisms are trying to protect themselves, and their consumers are trying to figure out how to get around those protections and still get a meal. But not everything is just as simple as who eats who. There's all kinds of other species interactions that are constantly occurring. So, for example, commensalism means that the dragonfly perches on, you know, a branch. Well, it's not interacting with that branch per se. It's not changing that branch. It's not hurting it or helping it. It's just perching there. So it is basically a interaction that doesn't have any consequences, but others do. So here is, for example, pollination, which most plants depend on outside pollinators. And certainly diversity depends on outside pollinators to mix up DNA for new potentially winning combinations. But remember that all living things are connected to the physical environment as well. So not all plants are pollinated by animals. Some are pollinated by the wind, a part of the physical environment, the non-living environment, and rely on that to move pollen. Likewise, once pollination and fertilization occur, The seed has to be dispersed. So sometimes that's done by water or wind. Those are part of the physical environment, but also living organisms move seeds around. They might be caching them like the scrub jay does. It might move through the intestinal tract, like in the case of the cedar waxwing, or seeds might cling to feathers and fur of organisms and move them around. Now, I think this is a cautionary tale against wearing Birkenstocks in the field. Okay, then another type of interaction that occurs in communities is mutualism, where there's a relationship between two different species and it's mutually beneficial. So in this case, the ants are protecting the aphids from other predators. And so obviously the aphids are being helped. They're getting something out of it. What's the ant getting out of it? The ant has access to the aphid's honeydew. So aphids drink all this phloem, the sugary sap that plants make, and to get the nitrogen and other micronutrients it needs, it passes a lot of that sugar through its body. So the aphids lick that honeydew up, get a free sugary meal, so they protect their aphids in the meantime. So both species benefit from this relationship. Now, sometimes the relationships are so intimate that the organisms are physiologically integrated together. This is called symbiosis. Symbiosis means literally living together. And this is a picture of mycorrhizae. If you haven't heard of mycorrhizae, it literally translates to fungus root, myco, fungus, rhizae, root. And these are fungal hyphae or threads that live on the roots of vascular plants. And essentially all vascular plants have mycorrhizal associations. The fungi is helping the plant to absorb nutrients and water. So the plant benefits. The fungi also benefits because it's getting a share of that sugary photosynthate that the plant is making. Now, not all symbiotic relationships are mutualistic. Some are parasitic, like the mistletoe in this tree, which has its little tendrils tapped into the tree, getting photosynthate, but not giving anything back in this case, just siphoning off energy. So that would be a parasitic symbiotic relationship. Okay, so we've got our parasites there. They're extracting energy from a living host. A good parasite doesn't kill their host, by the way. They may weaken it and lead to an early demise, but you don't want to necessarily kill your free lunch. And these connections, again, go so deep in the evolution of species that parasites actually have helped drive evolution and are so integrated into their host life that they can in fact even change their host's behavior to benefit themselves. And that's why whenever I do anything too crazy, I do say the parasite made me do it. So now switching gears, I want to take you on a tour through the Laguna habitat types and talk about common species. I certainly can't cover them all, but I tried to pick ones that were most familiar and some that have good stories associated with them. This is a really old drawing of one of the early explorations into the Laguna when Europeans arrived in this part of California, describing the Laguna as this series of disconnected pools in the summertime that filled and overflowed in the winter. So those pools, I always think of like beads on a string, and they are still there in the Laguna. This is one of my favorites, and it's at the base of City of Santa Rosa Alpha Farm property, a natural area managed for natural resources, and has this big open water pond. Okay, so what's going on there? Lots of sunlight hitting the water. Oh, that's good for our producers. Who's living there? Well, this is a cyanobacteria. We also have algae. So here is a diatom, a unicellular algae, floating up towards the surface where it gets lots of sunlight, making food. Then we have larger plants. This is filamentous algae here, but the others are vascular plants, including the duckweed, which we're all familiar with, and hydrocaudal, the marsh pennywort. We then have consumers to eat those plants. So these are protozoans. Here are microscopic animals called rotifers. We're starting to see crustaceans now that we could just see with the naked eye. And then we get to our macroinvertebrates, things like water striders and water boatmen and back swimmers. The fish, of course, are there to eat those macroinvertebrates, and then other organisms come in to eat the fish. And in fact, when we look at these big open water areas, that is extremely attractive, especially to migratory and overwintering waterfowl, that I think these big ponds of water are like this giant neon sign that says, you know, here's a place to spend the night. Here's your diner, your hotel, your refueling station. So we do have incredible waterfowl, and I'm just going to be honest and say I'm a little biased towards birds. They've sort of been responsible for every good thing that's happened to me in my life. So here are ducks, and these are all dabbling ducks. So you would find these ducks in shallower water. So some, like the mallard, who's just duck butt up here, they're here year round. Others, like the American widgeon in the upper right corner, are migratory, as are the pintail. Strugglers stay around, but in lower numbers. Then other ducks you'll find in deeper waters because they dive for their food. And that means then that if you see, you know, a bufflehead or a common merganser or a ruddy duck, you'll know that the water's a little deeper there. Then other birds wade at the margins. So these different types of shorebirds, again, some migratory, some permanent resident. The length of their legs and their bills dictate what they will feed on and where they will feed. So they sort of partition out the resource so that there's plenty of food for everyone. Well, now I want to switch from just the big open water to where we find forests along the water's edge and expanding out. This habitat is referred to as riparian habitat. So it has a component of woody plant species associated with these waterways. And again, this is a City of Santa Rosa reclamation farm. So this is the Redota Trail for reference. Probably many of you are familiar with it. And that the laguna flows through the base. The trees at the bottom of the picture, that's the railroad forest. Let's take a closer look at that, looking from the Sebastopol side. So it maybe doesn't look very big, but when you're in it, it actually feels big. And we must understand that we've cut down about 90% of our riparian forests in the Laguna de Santa Rosa. So what's left, this is pretty incredible reference site for what it looked like and how far that riparian area extended away from the main channel. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we've got this layered habitat where almost like a triple-decker sandwich where you have, the water at the bottom as the bread and the soil. And what grows on the bottom layer? Well, you've got your grasses and sedges and rushes. And then you've got maybe some forbs like mugwort or soaproot. And then you've got your first woody species. So these are shrubs like poison oak and California blackberry and wild rose. Then you've got your small trees like willow and elderberry and hawthorn. And then you've got, you know, your next layer of taller trees, including ash and box elder. And then emerging at the top layer of the sandwich, the valley oaks, which grow on the edges of the waterways as well as throughout the floodplain. They're dormant in the winter months, so they're able to handle that inundation without any problem. Okay, then a few slides for inhabitants of the riparian area. These organisms would overlap with open water, but I pictured here all insect species that lay their eggs in the water. So their young are aquatic, the larvae are aquatic and then metamorphose into a terrestrial adult. Fish species, there's just over 20 fish species in the Laguna. About half of them are native to this watershed. The others were introduced for various reasons, mostly game species. So this is always an interesting photograph. I don't know if he shot that carp. I don't see a fishing pole, but that carp is actually the most populous species in the Laguna. They do very well. The Laguna is what we could call eutrophic. It's nutrient rich, low in oxygen, high in food potential, but you know, kind of on the warm side and again on the low oxygen side. You've probably seen carp. They're able to come up and actually gulp water at, air at the surface. So that helps them in those low oxygen conditions. But here are some of the native species in the Laguna. So three-spined stickleback in the upper right corner, California roach in the lower right. And then on the left side, at the top, the Sacramento sucker and also Sacramento blackfish. Now, that is interesting because they're named after the Sacramento River system. And it turns out that if you go back far enough in time, the Laguna did used to empty in what is now San Pablo Bay. It wasn't quite San Pablo Bay back then, but so we share a lot of fish species with the Sacramento River, and that again is, you know, a connection in geologic time. Here is a juvenile steelhead. This is the rainbow trout that goes to sea. So fish species that are hatched in fresh water, spend their first year or two of life in creeks, flush out to the ocean, spend the next few years growing big, eating marine-derived nutrition, and then when it's time to reproduce, swimming back to their natal creek, finding their way home again, and laying their eggs in spawning gravels in freshwater creeks. So the steelhead is an example of an anadromous fish, as are Chinook and coho. And they all have taken a beating because we've done damage to the two habitats they're relying on. They need good conditions in the creek. They need high oxygen levels. They need access to food. They need places to hide under bank cuts and lots of shade to keep the water cooler and the oxygen levels higher. We've changed those conditions. We've also changed the conditions in the ocean. So by restricting the flow of rivers to the ocean, we've actually minimized the timing and quantity of the nutrients that reach the sea, and therefore we've impacted the plankton blooms that occur as the base of the food web. So you can have problems in the ocean, you can have problems in the creeks, and those are both huge problems for these fish species. You know, legend goes that you used to be able to go out with a pitchfork and get yourself a big salmon from one of any number of creeks in our Russian River watershed. Here's the Russian River watershed. We're down here at the southern end of it, and you can see all the yellow lines indicate where anadromous fish used to spawn, and now we're restricted mostly to the main stem of the Russian River and a few tributary creeks. The population is going to vacillate from year to year, depending on both ocean conditions and creek conditions. And, you know, of course, a lot is being done to help these species. They are protected under state and federal law under the Endangered Species Act. Well, on to other inhabitants. I put the western pond turtle here. It is our only native turtle species. You may see an odd red-eared slider out there, thermoregulating on a log. Some birds are fond of protected areas in the Laguna. They don't want to be out on the open water. The wood duck is one such example. And they actually breed in cavities of trees near the Laguna corridor. So the wood duck is just a spectacular looking duck. The male in particular, of course, his job is to be beautiful. That's what signals his fitness. The female, of course, it's to her benefit to be well camouflaged, as are the young. Here's a female hooded merganser, another really spectacular bird found here in the wintertime, and the male, which whenever I see this, I think, thank you very much. So now we've got double-crested cormorant, very aquatic bird, big webbed feet, dives for fish, but breeds in trees in the riparian corridor, usually in rookeries with other herons and egrets, like this great egret pictured here, or this great blue heron. All right, so now we're on to our next habitat type. We've got now an area that doesn't have huge tree cover. So this whole middle reach of the Laguna, not many trees. We've got them starting again down here, and then of course up here is the railroad forest that I was showing you earlier near Sebastopol, but in between, not many trees, and instead a different vegetation type that signifies a freshwater marsh. This is emergent vegetation. It begins its growth below the surface of the water and emerges up into the light. Has the best of both worlds: toes in the water for constant access and leaves in the sunshine. So freshwater marshes do tend to be highly productive habitat types. In other words, lots of photosynthesis going on. The vegetation is dominated by species of cattails and tules and other emergent plants. There are some secret denizens buried away in all that biomass, including the ridgeway rail here on the top left and the marsh wren below it. Other more obvious visitors like the red-winged blackbird. Many bird species will actually weave together stems of this emergent vegetation to have a nest protected from terrestrial predators. The American bittern is so adapted to this emergent vegetation that it even looks like a cattail. They pose with their neck stretched up like that, and the striations on their breast make them almost impossible to distinguish between the marsh vegetation unless they move. All right, now we're moving to a transitional habitat between wetland, wet all the time, and terrestrial, and that's the vernal pool. So we have seasonal wetlands in our Mediterranean climate that pond for 3 to 5 months during the winter. And this wet-dry regime has led to unique opportunities for species that can handle that challenge of being inundated for part of the year and completely dry for the other part. So you can see from this landscape picture that some vernal pools are natural and some are created, and some all have been destroyed just by years of agriculture breaking the hard pan layer and filling in the depressions that would collect water. So a few vernal pool species, the earliest blooming lob's buttercup, ranunculus lobii. When the water draws down, that's when you get the biggest blooms. So a few things will bloom in standing water, but most plants wait until the water is drawn down and you just get these spectacular displays. We do have a number of endemic species that are geographically restricted to the Santa Rosa Plain and the vernal pool habitat. So these 4 species are all listed as endangered by both the state and federal Endangered Species Act. And they are so rare, they're in danger of extinction. Again, the reason is because they don't have backup populations elsewhere. They live one place and one place only. And like all wetlands across California, we've filled about 90% of our vernal pools. So what's left has definitely become precious. Other species take advantage of the wet-dry regime, like this Pacific chorus frog, or whatever they're calling them these days. They lay their eggs in vernal pools. They don't have to worry about predation from fish species because the pools are temporary, and they'll hatch out. And then it's a race against time. Will they be able to go from an aquatic larvae, a tadpole, to a terrestrial adult before the pool dries up? And same for the California tiger salamander, another listed species that uses vernal pools to breed. Well, now I'm into the grassland. And I show this picture. I don't know how well it comes across, but it's showing bunch grasses. This is Danthonia californica, or California oat grass, with little forbs or wildflowers in between these small clumps. So these clumps would be, ankle to shin high, as opposed to what our grassland looks like in general, which is a mass of introduced species of annual grasses that have come from other parts of the world. And of course, no self-respecting wildflower is going to be able to get its head up in a sea of grasses like that. So we've lost a lot of our forbs, our colorful spring forbs. Some have done okay, like California buttercup. It is toxic, so the cows don't eat it, but they do eat the grasses down, and that helps the buttercup. But believe it or not, this is what the Rincon Valley of my youth looked like. It was wall to wall lupins and poppies in particular. And it is not like that anymore. So embedded in the grassland are different tree species. I'm just featuring oaks at the moment. Black oaks tend to grow in the higher parts of the grassland. They don't like it down in the floodplain too much. Coast live oaks as well, you'll find on the rises and foothills. And then the valley oak, which really is this tree that visually defines the Santa Rosa Plain. It grows on the banks, it grows in the floodplain, it grows in the uplands, and it is a species that will grow in high density if left to its own devices. But humans have been manipulating this landscape for a long time. And so even when the earliest explorers got here, they found that there was very even, almost deliberate spacing between the trees. To have fewer trees means higher acorn production from any given tree, a clear line of sight for hunting underneath those trees, and also biodiversity within the understory flora for more food potential. So the oak is this super powerful tree that makes acorns, which is amazing food for so many critters. But it turns out every part of a valley oak is edible. And I just put in this picture of all kinds of different galls that live on valley oaks. So galls are made when an insect irritates the tissue of the oak tree. It could be a stem, it can be a leaf. And the oak tree responds by growing protective tissue to encapsulate or minimize the damage of this insect that's gnawing away at it. And the insect takes advantage of that by laying its eggs inside this woody tissue, and the larvae grow and emerge eventually from the gall. So each galler makes a unique gall shape that it comes from the interaction between the DNA of the galler and the gallee. So even when an oak tree is dead, it's valuable as a roost, as a cavity for nesting in, and therefore we can consider the valley oak a keystone species, that its importance is greater than just its number would indicate, because so many different organisms feed on it, roost on it, nest in it, etc., that we find this, really profound web of life associated with these trees. So here's just a few grassland inhabitants, lots of insects, or arthropods in the grassland, not just insects, but arachnids like spiders and centipedes and millipedes. Here's a couple of amphibian species that you'll find associated with oaks, especially if you turn over logs or look under rocks: slender salamander and arboreal salamander. Reptiles, including lizards. So these are the two most common lizards I see in the Laguna: western fence lizard and northern alligator lizard. There's over a dozen snake species in the watershed. Here's the most common ones I see. From the upper left, that's a sharp-tailed snake. It's just pencil size. It's the cutest little snake. Murder on slugs. Garter snakes, comfortable in and out of the water, upper right. Lower left, gopher snakes, and common king snake at the bottom right. Okay, then this is my charismatic mammal slide, where we love mammals. We've got mammals that are herbivores. We've got, our omnivore mammals, and we've got our carnivore mammals. We even have, of course, mountain lions working their way through the Laguna. This is kind of a fun one. I threw this picture in just because a coworker happened to see a ringtail cat come down for a drink on one of the city recycled water holding ponds. So they're out there. They're primarily nocturnal, but you do see them from time to time. Grassland birds. Grassland birds are one of the groups of birds that are in the most trouble now, because grasslands are flat and easy to develop for both agriculture and urban suburban areas. So grassland birds are really suffering right now. Birds that might primarily be found around the water take advantage of food wherever it is. So here's a great egret that was following me on my tractor, and the bulge in its throat is a mouse or a vole that I disturbed. These are all examples of flycatchers that we find in the grassland and also associated with the wetter areas. And birds associated with the oak trees, again, hundreds of bird species in the Laguna. You're never going to run out of favorites. Birds of prey and even bald eagle, again, have returned and are breeding in the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is a triumph, because bald eagles, along with other top predator birds, were wiped out by the use of DDT, the pesticide, which was biomagnified as it was transferred up the food web. And bald eagles certainly didn't go extinct, but they were extirpated from this part of California and found only in regions to the far north where there was less agriculture, essentially. So they've slowly made their way back. And I think that we can say, from the abundance of predators we have, that we have a good, strong foundation in our trophic structure, and it's encouraging to see that. Woven throughout are all these decomposers and detritivores that are recycling and cleaning up our world. All right, well, last little leg of the journey is just to say that we know that even though the health of the Laguna is actually improved, overall, worldwide, biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate. And why is that? Well, I mean, people is the ultimate answer, but what are we doing? Well, we're destroying habitat, we're removing habitat and fragmenting it. Here's where Santa Rosa Creek goes underground for a couple of blocks in downtown Santa Rosa. We are moving species around the world, both accidentally and intentionally. And some of these species become quite invasive and can do damage to natural plant and animal communities. So yellow star thistle, one plant doesn't look too dangerous, but what about 1/10 of the state of California covered with this one plant? Here's perennial pepperweed, one of our invasive species in the Laguna. Here's Ludwigia, the aquatic water primrose, which of course can take over vast amounts of habitat. Okay, and then pollution. So that is also driving down biodiversity. We have, of course, a connection between every part of upland habitat and our creeks. So as we say, if it's on the street and it goes down here, it comes out here and it's in the creek. So we have to be incredibly careful in all of our upland activities as well to make sure that we're not mobilizing pollutants that will end up impacting the creek and of course the creek on out to the ocean. Okay, and then lastly, just overconsumption of resources, taking too much of any one species. The lower right is a picture from the gold rush era of California when people were coming out of San Francisco and extracting resources from Sonoma County, including cutting down valley oaks, burning them down to charcoal, and then taking that back to San Francisco for fuel, and of course would move up to the gold fields from there. And then lastly, just kind of the elephant in the room, that we have climate change as a game changer in the Laguna. There's a lot of people who are skeptical about the evidence. Let me just assure you that the evidence is strong for climate change, and you don't need anything more compelling than the evolution of underwear. You know, it used to be so chilly you had to wear long underwear, but the evolution has gotten skimpier and skimpier. And so, of course, that means that the climate must be warming. And bottom line is we can see based on modeling that there will be changes in the Laguna. I won't dwell on this, but I'm basically saying that we're going to have to factor that into our long-term management plans, and that it's going to make it ever more challenging for concentrations of populations in a state prone to long, multiple years of drought with less Sierra snowpack to rely on. Now, we're lucky here in Sonoma County. We have what we call homegrown water. We're not reliant on the Sierra snowpack as the whole central and southern part of the state. Nonetheless, we'll have to manage our water resources more carefully as well. Well, at the end of the day, the biodiversity is just this beautiful opportunity to aesthetically enjoy our world, but it goes even beyond that with all of the ecosystem services that help to keep us healthy, and that these ecosystem services are done absolutely for free by nature. But we do have to protect natural systems to allow these services, these functions to occur. So I'm advocating, obviously, for more nature, more biodiversity, and more life in the Laguna, not only for us today, but of course for our future generations. And I'll just leave you with one last thought. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. If you haven't heard of Shinrin-yoku, it translates to forest bathing. It's a Japanese practice of taking a meditative approach to being in nature. It doesn't mean you have to be alone. You can certainly enjoy doing this with other people, but the idea is to pay attention to the smaller details of your surroundings. So what are the smells? What are the sounds? What is the feeling in your body when you're in nature? And they've done a lot of studies to indicate that there are health benefits associated with being in nature. Not much of a surprise there. And as I've been sort of meditating in nature, what I've found is that it basically gets all my chakras firing. I don't even know what a chakra is really, but I can feel my head and my heart and all my nether regions connected and feel this deep contentment and joy associated with that. And, you know, I mean, who could want for more? So I'm encouraging you all to enjoy the life in the Laguna. And I know that you already do, or you wouldn't be here today. So thank you for caring, and thank you for sharing with me today. And now I'm going to turn it back to Chris.
Thank you, Denise. Yes, I always feel inspired by your presentations. Thank you. There are 3 questions I'd like to bring forward from the chat if we have a few more minutes. Yes, we do. Let's start with trout. The question was, do we know about the trout population levels from this past winter? And do we know about the impacts of late rains on fish migration?
Well, I haven't seen any data that usually lags well behind, you know, any given year. The Water Agency website would be a good place to look and see if you can drill down to what the counts were coming through the fish ladder this year. But I haven't heard any reports as of yet.
Okay, we'll look at sonomawater.org for more information there. Also, bald eagles. Can we? The question was, when did we start seeing bald eagles again?
Well, okay, it always seems like time has passed much more quickly or slowly than you think. But I'm going to say that the bald eagles have been nesting in the Laguna for at least a decade now, and we're probably venturing into the Laguna watershed slightly before that. They showed up at Lake Sonoma and also out at the Hennessy, near the Hennessy Dam at Lake Berryessa, even before that. So they've been in our region for the last 20 plus years, but they've become a much more commonly seen species in the last decade.
Yeah, all right, thank you. And one more. The question was, please say more about the historical connection of the Laguna to San Francisco Bay. How long ago was that, and what happened to change the flow?
Okay, well, it was millions of years ago. I have, you know, my details are going to be slim because I haven't reread, you know, the timeline recently, but basically it all goes back to matter cycles, right? And as the Pacific plate crashes into the North American plate, it's changing the topography of the landscape. It's pushing up land in some places, and then there'll be erosion and valleys occurring other places. So again, it's not quite proper to say that the Laguna used to flow to San Pablo Bay, but it used to flow in that direction towards what is now San Pablo Bay. And that we do have this overlapping fish population with the Sacramento River drainage now.
Okay, great, thank you. And one last question that just came in. What about badgers? Have we seen them in the Laguna?
Oh, yes. They are definitely in the Laguna. We have them on the city recycled water farms. Anecdotally, I'll say that their populations are rising. I certainly see more evidence of badgers now than I did, say, 20 years ago. I've seen them very close to the Laguna Channel proper and then further away. And the thing I think I've observed about badgers is that, you know, they don't make tunnels and live in them. They make tunnels and feed in them, and then they move on. And of course, you know, when they're breeding, they'll have a home base for that period. But they're definitely more mobile than I had kind of understood them to be. And so, you know, they're just such master diggers that they can create, you know, these feeding tunnels, you know, in a single evening and get every last gopher and mole and then move on the next day. So I think that they're increasing in the Laguna currently.
Cool, thank you, thank you. All right, that concludes our question period. So again, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Wow. Well, thank you, Denise, for giving us so much wonderful and informative and truly joyful, a lot of joyful information about this amazing biodiverse watershed. And I know I was laughing out loud, I can say. That Birkenstock slide really got me. I really feel like that's a more relevant warning here in Sonoma County than you might imagine. And I also learned some really amazing things too. And I'm sure the audience was laughing and learning so much throughout the webinar as well. So thank you. And thank you all for attending and participating today. And thank you for supporting our online programs. Now is the time to add your last comments and questions to the chat. We can follow up with questions in an email afterward if there's anything we didn't get to. I'll be ending the webinar after these last announcements. If you have the means to donate at this time to support our critical conservation, restoration, and education work in the Laguna watershed, we would greatly appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who already donated upon registering for this program. We have I think we have one webinar per week scheduled until mid-June. Coming up next week, we're continuing the wildlife theme with an animal tracking webinar with Megan Walla-Murphy. And I'm sure that you'll find her insight helpful even if you're staying close to your home during these times. And we'll start off June with another webinar with botanist and Santa Rosa Junior College instructor Caprice Disbro on the coevolution of plants and pollinators. And finally, we will conclude our spring run of virtual programs with Laguna de Santa Rosa, past and present, with Sonoma County Regional Parks. So thanks for continuing to learn about and engage with the Laguna from home. Hopefully people are spending more time out there now that the parks are open, which is great. You know, I think that's it for my announcements. Stay tuned with more programs coming for the summer, and hopefully we'll be able to have in-person programs at some point in the near future. We look forward to being out there with you on the land again. Denise, thank you again for your wonderful presentation. And I hope you all out there in the audience take good care of yourselves. Thank you, and see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.